the idea that someone can suffer from some sort of psychological problem, and that by talking to someone in a very particular way, in a very particular setting, that can bring about symptom relief. That whole idea was originated by the psychoanalysts, and in particular Sigmund Freud. So Freud was a medical doctor who was working at the end of the 1800s, the beginning part of the 1900s. And he was particularly interested in a group of patients who seemed to have symptoms with no known medical cause. So for instance, they might suddenly be struck mute, selectively mute, or they might be paralyzed in just one part of their body suddenly in a way that didn't match any sort of known neurological model of paralysis. Now, many of these patients who had these physical symptoms were young women, and a dominant theory at the time, and in fact a theory that had been debated since ancient Greece, was the idea that these women suffered from what was known as hysteria. So hysteria is still a word that you might have heard. Someone's hysterical. And hysterical comes from the Greek word for uterus. So the idea at the time in the mid-1800s was that maybe these people were suffering from various unexplained symptoms because something was wrong with their uterus. And in particular, maybe it had gone missing, gotten dislodged, was wandering around the body unsupervised. And why would you think that? Well, they were heavily influenced by ideas about gender and gender roles. And the idea is that women were most satisfied and their bodies were fulfilling their purpose if they were married and if they were bearing children. So in particular, young, unmarried women were thought, because they hadn't fulfilled their gender roles, that maybe there was something wrong with their uterus, and that was what was causing these symptoms. So it was against this backdrop of thinking about gender, sex, motherhood, relationships, a whole Victorian atmosphere towards gender and sex that Freud was working. And he thought, well, maybe it's not the uterus that these patients are suffering from. Maybe there's something else going on. So he began a very careful set of conversations with people who are suffering from various symptoms to try to get at, well, what are they thinking about? What seems to be the onset of their troubles? And in doing that, he began to develop the iceberg model of consciousness. So the first is that there's a part of consciousness that's aware, available to conscious reflection. That's the part of the iceberg that's sticking up above the water. And then there's a vast amount of the iceberg that's below water, that's not available to conscious awareness. So the key aspect of Freud's insight was that there was a lot of stuff going on in our minds, our wishes, our fantasies, our emotions, our drives, our desires, our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, that we were not aware of, that there was a vast amount of stuff that was going on unconsciously. So again, if we go back to this iceberg model of consciousness, we can see that consciousness is divided into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. So what are these parts, Sam? Id, ego, and superego.
So the id is completely unconscious, and the id is our kind of basic urges, our basic infantile urges: feed me, sex, violence. You can imagine, just a kind of demanding infant, just wanting these things without any kind of regard for anything else. We've mentioned this as a model of tension. On the other side of this is this sort of superego. And superego, Freud thought of as the kind of internalized voice of a parent or caregiver. So this might be our standards, society standards, our conscience, what it is we think is appropriate behavior in a given context. And then mediating between these is the ego. So the ego would have to kind of mediate between these sort of basic wishes of the id and the kind of standards of the superego.
The goal of therapy then is to bring these conflicts out of unconsciousness into conscious awareness so that they can be resolved. But that's not easy to do. These things are unconscious for a reason, according to Freud. They're very threatening, they're very anxiety-provoking. We have defense mechanisms that repress things, that keep them down. And so a huge part of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory grew up around, well, how do you make the unconscious conscious?